The Castrato Singer. In 18th century Italy, families had an estimated 4,000 boys castrated each and every year in the hope of fame and fortune. The operation before puberty preserved the high boyish voice and combined it with an adult's lung power. As early as 1599, the Sistine Chapel in Rome admitted its first castrati. The most famous was Farinelli, born Carlo Broschi in 1705, celebrated at Europe's courts like a superstar. Yet only a fraction of the boys achieved such fame. Most were left mutilated and penniless. Only in 1903 did Pope Pius X ban castrati from church singing. The last, Alessandro Moreschi, died in 1922. His recordings from 1902 still survive today. The tooth puller. For centuries, tooth extraction was a public spectacle in Europe's marketplaces. Itinerant tooth pullers traveled from fair to fair with drummers and performers whose noise drowned out patients' screams. Effective anesthesia did not exist. Ether anesthesia was first successfully demonstrated in Boston only in 1846. Teeth were pulled with the so-called dental key, an iron lever instrument that often damaged the jaw. In 18th century Paris, Le Grand Thomas became legendary, extracting teeth on the Pont Neuf and presenting himself as the terror of the human mouth. Broken roots, infections, and blood poisoning very often proved fatal. Yet modern dentistry grew from this very trade. In 1728, the Frenchman Pierre Fauchard published his groundbreaking work, Le Chirurgien Dentiste, the professional mourner. Paid tears are older than the Roman Empire. In ancient Egypt, professional mourning women accompanied the dead, and in Rome, the so-called prefecti led funeral processions, wailing loudly and tearing their hair depending on the payment. A large entourage signaled the deceased person's power and status. In 19th century Victorian England, the profession enjoyed a new flowering. So-called mutes stood silently, dressed in black. Outside the mourning house, Charles Dickens immortalized the trade in Oliver Twist in 1838, where young Oliver must work as a funeral child. Remarkably, the profession never disappeared. The body snatcher. In 18th and early 19th century Britain, fresh corpses were sought-after commodities. Anatomy schools required ever more bodies for teaching, but legally almost only the corpses of executed criminals were available. So-called resurrection men therefore opened fresh graves at night, pulled the dead from their coffins, and sold them to doctors and universities. Because a corpse was not legally considered property, offenders were often prosecuted only for stealing clothing or coffin parts. Relatives had iron cages erected over graves or kept watch beside the dead for days. William Burke and William Hare became notorious when, in Edinburgh in 1828, they stopped waiting for natural deaths, murdered people, and sold their bodies to the anatomist Robert Knox. The public outcry led to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which gave medical institutions regulated access to unclaimed corpses and largely removed the trade's foundation. The leech collector. In early 19th century Europe, leeches were regarded as universal medicine. Doctors used them against fevers, inflammations, and other ailments, creating demand for millions of animals. Leech collectors supplied them by wading through marshes and shallow ponds. They often used bare legs as bait. Once enough leeches had attached themselves, the collectors removed them and sold them to pharmacists or doctors. The work was poorly paid and harmful to health. Repeated blood loss weakened collectors, while the wounds could continue bleeding for hours after removal and might become infected. The poet William Wordsworth created a literary memorial to such a worker in his 1802 poem, Resolution and Independence. By the mid-19th century, the trade collapsed. Excessive harvesting had severely depleted populations, while medical bloodletting was losing importance in medicine. The mudlark. At low tide in Victorian London, the poorest of the poor crawled across the banks of the Thames. They were called mudlarks. With bare hands, they searched among rubbish animal bones and excrement for pieces of coal, nails, ropes, coins, or anything else they could sell. Many were children sent out by their families with only a few hours before the tide returned. The river mud could be deep and treacherous. Anyone trapped or surprised by the water risked drowning. Hardly anyone became wealthy from it. A day in the mud often earned only a few pennies. As London's port modernized and waste disposal became more regulated, mudlarking disappeared as an occupation of poverty. The name survived, however. Today it describes people who, with permission, search the Thames foreshore for finds. The church sleeper-waker. In English churches, sermons in the 17th and 18th centuries could last several hours, and the congregation dozed off. To prevent this, many parishes hired the paid sluggard waker. Armed with a long pole, he patrolled the pews. Sleeping men received a jab from the wooden knob. For women, he used the pole's other end, fitted with a foxtail or feather. A gentle tickle on the face was enough. Church records document payment from parish funds, for example, in the parish of Acton in 1725. As services became shorter, the office disappeared in the 19th century. The cesspit emptier. In Tudor England, hardly any house had sewerage. The waste of entire towns collected in cesspits. Their emptying was handled by gong farmers permitted to work only between 9 at night and 5 in the morning. They climbed into the pits with shovel and bucket and carted the contents beyond the city walls, where it was sold as fertilizer. The pay was surprisingly high, sometimes several times a day wage. The price, toxic gases, disease, and social ostracism. As early as 1326, the Londoner Richard the Raker drowned in his own latrine pit. Only the modern sewer systems of the 19th century finally ended this occupation. The Sin Eater. In Wales and the English border regions, people believed until the 19th century that sins could be eaten. When someone died without confessing, the family summoned the Sin Eater. Bread was placed over the corpse and beer was served, and by consuming both, the Sin Eater symbolically assumed the dead person's sins, saving the soul from restless wandering. The payment was only a few pennies. Sin Eaters lived on society's margins, shunned like lepers because they carried the guilt of countless strangers. The last known Sin Eater, Farmer Richard Munslow, died in 1906 in the village of Ratlinghope, Shropshire. His restored grave commemorates the custom there today. The ornamental hermit. In 18th century England, melancholy was considered a sign of profundity, and those who could afford it bought it. Wealthy landowners built artificial grottos in their landscaped gardens and paid men to live there as wild-looking hermits. The contracts were strict. 7 years in residence, no haircuts, no trimmed nails, no speaking to guests. Charles Hamilton offered £700 for 7 years at his Paynes Hill Park estate in Surrey, a fortune. His hermit was exposed after only 3 weeks, however, when he was caught at the local inn. Around 1830, the living garden ornaments disappeared, replaced by something far easier to maintain and manage: stone garden gnomes.